There are few things more powerful than a child's laughter, especially when that laughter is full of innocence and joy. For Emily, a young girl with cerebral palsy, playing outside in her front yard was her freedom, a space where she could experience the world around her despite her challenges. Her mother, a constant support and guide, watched from the porch, knowing that for Emily, these moments were more than just play. They were her way of experiencing the world that often felt out of reach. The lawn, her own personal space, was where she could feel like any other child, where her wheelchair didn't define her and where she was free to be herself. But little did she know that freedom was about to be stolen from her. Emily's mother had always made sure she was surrounded by love, care, and safety. They lived in a quiet, gated community where everyone knew each other, and in theory, the rules were meant to protect the peace. But for some, those rules became something more, a tool for control. Among the neighbors, there was one woman who felt that the small things, the things that brought Emily joy, were somehow a threat. Karen, the HOA enforcer, had never been fond of the noise Emily made while playing, despite it being the laughter of a child enjoying her life. The lawn, the place where Emily felt most alive, was Karen's battleground. At first, it seemed harmless. A few whispered complaints here and there, nothing that would normally raise alarm. But soon, those quiet whispers turned into more aggressive actions. There were letters, warnings, even threats. This is a private community, and we all must follow the rules, Karen would say, as if Emily's joy were a breach of some unspoken code. Emily's mother, while confused by the tension, always kept her head high and continued to let Emily play. She knew how important these moments were for her daughter's emotional well-being, but little did she know that standing up for her daughter's right to play was soon going to lead to a confrontation that would change everything. It started innocently enough, a typical sunny afternoon where Emily, thrilled by the idea of playing with her favorite flower, wheeled herself to her favorite spot on the lawn. The world seemed right in that moment. Emily was full of excitement, laughing as the wind tousled her hair and the birds chirped in the background. It was as if the whole world was in harmony. But behind the white picket fences, there was a simmering anger and injustice waiting to unfold. Karen had been watching from her window, as she always did. Her gaze was cold, sharp, and full of judgment, and she couldn't stand seeing Emily there. It wasn't just the noise, nor was it the disturbance Emily caused. It was the idea that Emily, in her wheelchair, dared to exist in a place she felt didn't belong to her kind of people. It wasn't enough for Karen to see Emily in her moment of joy. She had to put a stop to it to remind the family who really held the power in the community. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The soft sounds of Emily's laughter, her small movements on the grass, would soon be overshadowed by a single malicious action. A moment that would shatter their sense of security forever. A moment where innocence would be lost and the true colors of hatred would be exposed. In that instant, Emily's laughter, which had filled the air with light and warmth, would be silenced by the harsh crack of a gunshot. Karen, in her twisted sense of justice, had crossed a line that no one could have foreseen. It wasn't just the rules of the HOA she was enforcing anymore, it was her own sense of control, and Emily was her victim. The joyful sounds of a child's play were replaced by the harsh reality of a world that wasn't always kind to those who were different. The world, it seemed, was no longer safe. This story isn't just about a confrontation between a disabled child and an angry neighbor. It's about the lengths some people will go to impose their control over others. It's about the violation of basic human rights, rights that should never be infringed upon, no matter the circumstances. The moment Emily was shot was the moment everything changed for her family, for the community, and for anyone who believed that standing up for what's right mattered. But the question is, how far will Emily's family go to make sure that justice is served? And how far will Karen go to protect her twisted sense of authority? The lines are drawn, and the battle has just begun. As the days passed, the tension between Emily's family and the HOA, Karen began to build like a storm on the horizon, with an inevitable clash looming closer with every passing moment. The community, once seen as a peaceful haven, had slowly revealed its darker side, and at the heart of that darkness was Karen. She was not just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the rules, a woman who took the HOA's guidelines far too seriously, using them as a weapon to control everything and everyone around her. Her role was simple, but her actions were far from benign. Karen had always been a little too focused on the rules. From the start, her demeanor had been one of authority and judgment. At first, it was small things, an accusation of a misplaced garden gnome, a warning about the fence being an inch too high. But as time passed, the stakes grew higher. She began to scrutinize every inch of Emily's family's property. Every time Emily wheeled herself out onto the lawn, Karen was watching from her window, her eyes piercing through the blinds like a hawk waiting to swoop in for the kill. Emily's family tried to stay out of Karen's way, knowing how volatile she could be. But it wasn't long before the complaints started piling up. The first was a simple letter in the mailbox. It was vague but pointed. Excessive noise and disruptions on property. Please remember that we are a community of rules. At first, Emily's mother brushed it off, believing it was just another of Karen's petty grievances. But the letters kept coming, each one more direct than the last. Soon, Emily's mother was summoned to a HOA meeting, where Karen sat at the head of a table, arms folded and face stern, like a judge ready to pass sentence. At the meeting, the tension was palpable. Karen was relentless. "The rules are clear," she said, her voice cold and authoritative. "Children, particularly those with disabilities, need to be kept indoors unless absolutely necessary. This is a community, and we need to maintain peace and order." The word stung, but Emily's mother held her ground, fighting for her daughter's right to exist freely on her own property. She argued that Emily deserved the same joy as any other child, that her lawn was her safe space, her sanctuary. But Karen wasn't listening. Instead, she doubled down. "I'm just trying to maintain the quality of life here," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Your daughter's playtime is disturbing the peace. And it's not just her. I've received multiple complaints." The weight of Karen's words hung in the air like a cloud, suffocating the room with its oppressive judgment. But Emily's mother, though shaken, refused to back down. She knew that this wasn't about the noise, it was about something deeper. It was about control, about someone believing they had the power to dictate who belonged and who didn't. After that meeting, things only got worse. Karen seemed to be everywhere, showing up at the house unannounced, peering through windows, and lurking in the background like a shadow. Emily, oblivious to the growing animosity, continued to play outside, her laughter still filling the air. She didn't know the depth of the battle her mother was fighting. All she knew was that this lawn was hers, her place of freedom, and nothing could take that away. But Karen's surveillance was becoming more intense. Emily's mother would catch glimpses of her neighbor's figure behind the curtains, always watching, always waiting. The feeling of being watched was unsettling, but what was worse was the growing realization that Karen wasn't just trying to enforce rules, she was trying to strip away their sense of safety, their right to peace in their own home. One morning, Emily rolled out into her favorite spot, her wheelchair gliding smoothly over the grass. She was giggling as the wind danced around her, completely unaware that Karen was once again watching from behind the blinds. Karen's eyes were sharp, scanning every movement, every laugh, every second of joy that Emily experienced. It was clear now. Karen wasn't just concerned with rules, she had a personal vendetta, and the sight of Emily enjoying herself was something she couldn't tolerate. "She's doing it again," Karen muttered to herself as she pressed her face against the glass. "I'll put an end to this once and for all." Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone, tapping out a message to the HOA board. The request was simple. "This child is breaking the rules again. Something must be done." The message was sent, and once again, the storm of complaints began to brew. This time, however, things were different. Karen wasn't just being a nuisance anymore. She had crossed a line. She was setting the stage for something more extreme, something that would change everything for Emily and her family. Her eyes, still glued to Emily as she laughed in her wheelchair, were full of hate, not for the noise, not for the disruption, but for the fact that Emily dared to exist on her terms in her own space. The letters became more frequent, the warnings more severe. The family could no longer ignore the growing tension between them and their neighbor. They knew something was coming. Emily's mother could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just about the rules anymore. It was personal, and Karen wasn't going to stop until she had forced them to comply. With each passing day, the fear and anxiety that had once seemed distant were now palpable. Emily's laughter, once a sound of freedom, had begun to feel like a ticking time bomb, one that Karen was determined to silence. The family's safe haven, their lawn, was no longer a place of joy, but a battleground where the stakes were life and death. And Karen? She was standing on the other side, waiting for the right moment to strike. The day had started like any other, sunny, warm, and full of promise. Emily, full of energy and joy, wheeled herself out onto the grass, her favorite place in the world. Her laughter rang through the air, filling the yard with a sense of innocence and peace. She loved being outside, where the sky was wide and the grass soft beneath her, where she could imagine she was like any other child playing freely. Her wheelchair was no barrier, just another part of her world, and today, like every other day, she was excited to be outside. But today wasn't going to be like every other day. There was an unease in the air, something Emily couldn't put her finger on. She felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up as she rolled her chair toward the flower bed. She loved the colors, the bright reds and yellows that made her feel like she was part of something bigger, something beautiful. She bent down to pick a flower, her tiny hands trembling slightly as they reached out, eager to touch the petals. She didn't notice the shadow looming over her, the figure standing in her peripheral vision, watching every movement she made. Karen had been standing in her window for what felt like hours, her eyes locked on Emily. It wasn't just the noise anymore, it was the principle of the thing. She didn't want Emily, a disabled child, playing on her property, her pristine lawn. She'd put up with it for too long, and today she decided was the day it ended. This was her neighborhood, her rules, and no one, especially a child like Emily, was going to disrupt the order she had worked so hard to establish. As Karen stepped onto the lawn, Emily didn't see her at first. She was too caught up in the moment, too absorbed in the beauty of the flowers and the freedom of being outside. But then she heard it, the sharp, cutting voice that had come to symbolize everything wrong with her life here. Stop right there. Karen's voice was harsh, full of authority, a command meant to stop her in her tracks. Emily froze. Her hands were still wrapped around the flower she had just picked, but she could feel her heart begin to race. Her eyes shifted upward, meeting Karen's cold stare. She didn't understand. Why was she being yelled at? She was just playing like any other child would. She didn't deserve this. I was just picking a flower, Emily said softly, her voice trembling. Her confusion was palpable, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down around her. She looked around for her mother, who had always been there to protect her, to help her when things felt out of control. But today, her mother wasn't close by. She was inside, unaware of what was unfolding in front of her. Karen's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer, her fists clenching at her sides. The sight of Emily sitting there, so vulnerable, so unaware of the storm that was about to break, only fueled Karen's anger. "You think you can just do whatever you want?" she hissed. "This is my neighborhood, and I don't want a noise here. You're disturbing the peace." Emily, her voice barely above a whisper, repeated herself. "I was just playing. I didn't mean to disturb anyone." She wasn't crying yet, but she felt the first wave of fear creep in. She didn't understand why this woman was so angry. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She only wanted to feel normal, to have a moment of happiness like the other kids. But Karen wasn't listening. She wasn't hearing Emily's fear, her confusion, her vulnerability. She only saw a child on her lawn, breaking the rules she held so dear, and she was not about to let it slide. With trembling hands, Karen reached into her purse, her eyes still fixed on Emily, and pulled out a weapon. It was a gun, something that had no place in this moment, in this yard, in this world. For a brief moment, she hesitated, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. She could feel the tremor in her fingers, the hesitation, but her mind was made up. Emily was a threat to her authority, to the order she had created, and this was the only way to regain control. Emily's eyes widened as she saw the gun in Karen's hands, and for the first time, she felt true fear. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands instinctively tightened around the flower she had been holding. "Please don't," she whispered, her voice shaking as she tried to understand what was happening. I didn't mean to make you angry." But Karen wasn't listening to the pleading in Emily's voice. She raised the gun, her eyes cold and distant. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything was still. Time seemed to stretch, the air thick with tension, and Emily could only watch as Karen's finger tightened on the trigger. And then, without warning, the sound of the gunshot shattered the silence. It was deafening, a violent crack in the peaceful world that Emily had once known. The pain that followed was instant, and for a moment, everything went black. Before anyone could react, before anyone could stop it, Karen had pulled the trigger, and Emily's life would never be the same again. The deafening crack of the gunshot reverberated in the air, slicing through the serene afternoon. Emily's body jerked, her wheelchair spinning slightly with the impact. In that instant, everything around her seemed to go silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The vibrant colors of the flowers, the gentle breeze brushing her face, all faded into a haze as she felt a sharp, searing pain rip through her chest. She gasped, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her hands instinctively flew to her chest, but all she could feel was the warm, sticky blood soaking through her shirt. A scream tore through the air, and for a moment, Emily didn't even realize it was coming from her mother. She had been inside, trying to sort through some paperwork, unaware of the horror unfolding just outside her door. But the shrill sound of terror, a sound she would never forget, sent her bolting to the window. Her heart pounded as her eyes locked on Emily, who was now slumped in her wheelchair, blood dripping from her chest. Her mind couldn't process it. The world around her seemed to shatter in slow motion. She rushed outside, her legs weak beneath her as she reached her daughter, kneeling down beside her. "Emily!" she cried, panic flooding her voice as she cradled her daughter's face, feeling her pulse racing beneath her trembling fingertips. But Emily's eyes, though wide with fear, seemed unfocused, her body unable to respond in the way it once did. "Mom, it hurts. It hurts so much," Emily whispered, her voice faint, weak with the pain that was now consuming her. Her mother could feel her breath quicken as the terror set in, but she couldn't even form words. The world had collapsed, and there was nothing left but her daughter's agony and the horror of what had just transpired. "I'm so sorry, baby," Emily's mother choked out, tears streaming down her face as she frantically pressed her hands to her daughter's wound, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to do something, anything to help. But it was too much. The blood was pouring too quickly, and her attempts to stem the flow were futile. Behind them, the sound of Karen's footsteps grew louder as she approached, her demeanor cold, detached. She stood there, staring down at Emily with a look of twisted satisfaction in her eyes. "I told you this was my neighborhood," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You had no right to disturb the peace." The words hit like a slap, each one adding to the shock and disbelief that overwhelmed Emily's mother. She looked at Karen, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. "You did this? You shot my daughter? Why? Why would you?" But Karen interrupted her, a chilling smirk spreading across her face. She was a threat, a disruption. I had no choice. I had to put a stop to it. Her words were icy, calculated, as though the violence she had just committed was justified in her mind. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows were now stepping outside, drawn by the commotion. Some stood silently, eyes wide with disbelief, others mumbling to one another, unsure of what to say. A few of them cast a glance at Karen, nodding in what seemed like tacit approval. Others merely avoided looking at the scene, their heads down, pretending they didn't see the child bleeding out in the yard. It became clear this wasn't just about a conflict between two people. This was a community divided, a community that had quietly allowed injustice to fester in their midst. But for Emily's mother, none of that mattered. She didn't care about Karen's excuses or the neighbors who stood by, indifferent. All that mattered was Emily, her daughter, bleeding, terrified, and lying in the grass she had once loved. "Help!" Emily's mother screamed, her voice cracking with panic. "Someone, please call an ambulance. She's going to die." But no one moved and no one spoke. It felt as though the world had turned its back on her. As the minutes ticked by, the sound of sirens finally filled the air, but it felt like an eternity. When the paramedics arrived, they rushed to Emily's side, but by then the damage was done. They worked frantically, stabilizing her as best they could. But Emily's mother couldn't stop the tears from flowing, her heart breaking as she watched them wheel her daughter away, unsure if she would ever see her again. But the drama didn't end there. As the police arrived and began their investigation, they turned to Karen, who had already started to weave her version of events. She was breaking the rules, Karen insisted, her voice calm and measured, as though nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. "I had no choice. The HOA had warned her several times, and she ignored every rule. She was a threat to the community's peace." Emily's mother stood there, stunned, unable to fathom the words coming out of Karen's mouth. How could she say something so vile with such ease? The entire town was watching, and yet Karen's justification seemed to hold some twisted weight among those who remained silent, too afraid to speak up. The police took her statements, and despite the overwhelming evidence of what had just happened, they didn't seem to rush to arrest her. Instead, they asked more questions, gathered more details, and stood around as though they were unsure how to proceed. Emily's mother knew one thing for certain: the system was not going to deliver justice easily, if at all. The truth, as it often does, was getting twisted by the people who held power, who controlled the narrative. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As Emily was rushed to the hospital, her mother clutched her hand, whispering promises of retribution, of justice. She wouldn't stop until Karen was held accountable. They had taken everything from her, but they hadn't taken her will to fight. This was far from over. The battle for her daughter's future, for their family's safety, was only just beginning. And Emily's mother was determined to make sure the world knew exactly what had happened, no matter what it took. The aftermath of the shooting was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, each one more grueling than the last. Emily's mother, still reeling from the shock and pain of the traumatic event, now found herself at the center of a battle she never thought she would have to fight. The community that had once been so peaceful was now divided, and every day felt like an uphill struggle as the weight of the situation began to set in. From the very beginning, the legal system seemed slow to act. Karen, with her cool demeanor and carefully crafted narrative, had already positioned herself as the victim, claiming that she had acted out of self-defense, that Emily's presence on the lawn had been an act of aggression. Her words were calculated, her tone convincing, and for a moment it seemed as though the law might side with her. After all, the idea that a disabled child could pose a threat seemed too absurd to most people. But Karen had supporters, people who, for reasons of their own, chose to believe her version of events. Emily's mother, however, wasn't willing to let Karen's twisted version of the truth stand. She knew the gravity of the situation, and she couldn't allow her daughter's suffering to go unpunished. It was a fight for justice, but more importantly, it was a fight to ensure that something like this would never happen to anyone else. The first hearings were exhausting. Emily's mother had to retell the horrific story over and over again, each time with more emotion, as she struggled to hold back tears. She was a mother pleading for justice for her child, but the courtroom felt cold, distant, as though the pain she was experiencing didn't matter as much as the technicalities of the case. The prosecution pushed forward, presenting evidence that seemed overwhelming. Witnesses who had heard the shot, forensic reports showing the extent of the injuries, and even the 911 call that had been made just moments after Emily was shot. Despite the strong evidence against Karen, the defense was relentless. They focused on the idea that Karen had been provoked, that Emily's presence on the lawn was a disturbance to the community's peace. It was sickening to hear the defense twist the situation, to hear them paint Emily as some sort of threat rather than a child in her own yard, enjoying the simple pleasure of playing outside. But the courtroom wasn't just about presenting the facts. It was a game of perception, of manipulation, and Karen was playing her cards carefully. As the days wore on, Emily's mother felt herself growing more exhausted. The toll of the trial, combined with the trauma of seeing her daughter suffering, was beginning to take its toll. She was fighting not only for her daughter's right to justice, but for her own sanity. There were moments when she questioned whether the system would ever deliver what they deserved, whether Karen would walk free despite everything she had done. But then, as the trial progressed, something shifted. A key witness, a neighbor who had seen Karen pull the gun, came forward, willing to testify against her. This testimony was a turning point. It shattered Karen's narrative of self-defense and painted her actions in a much darker light. The neighbor described how Karen had been standing in her window, watching Emily for what seemed like an eternity, her anger building with every second, before finally stepping out and shooting Emily in cold blood. This was no act of self-defense. This was a deliberate, calculated attack. Despite the defense's best efforts to discredit the witness, the tide had turned. The weight of the evidence, combined with the emotional testimony of Emily's mother and the support of the community, began to shift the jury's opinion. It wasn't just about the law anymore. It was about what was right, what was just, and the realization that a child, disabled or not, had the right to play in her own yard without fear of violence. But even as the case seemed to be turning in their favor, Emily's mother knew that the road to justice was still long. She still had to face the possibility that Karen might be able to manipulate the system once again, or that the court might fail to deliver a fair verdict. The uncertainty of the outcome loomed over her like a dark cloud, but she couldn't stop now. Her daughter's life, her future, depended on it. The trial culminated in a final showdown, an emotional, gut-wrenching closing argument by the prosecution that left everyone in the courtroom stunned. Emily's mother, though exhausted and broken, took the stand one last time. She spoke not just as a mother, but as a woman determined to protect her child's dignity, to ensure that no one would ever treat her daughter as less than human. Her words were powerful, and for the first time, the courtroom seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The verdict came down swiftly, and it felt like the world had stopped turning for a moment as the jury delivered their decision. Guilty. Karen was convicted of attempted murder, and the community erupted in a mix of relief and disbelief. Emily's mother, though still overwhelmed with emotion, felt a sense of vindication wash over her. It wasn't just about the conviction, it was about the fact that, for the first time, someone had been held accountable for the injustice that had been done to her daughter. But even in victory, there's no joy. The road to recovery for Emily would be long and painful, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would remain for a lifetime. The legal battle had been won, but the emotional toll of what had happened would take much longer to heal. The damage had been done, and while Karen would face the consequences of her actions, Emily's mother knew that nothing would ever truly erase the trauma of that day. In the end, the case was a bittersweet reminder of how easily innocence could be shattered, and how sometimes the fight for justice is just as much about healing as it is about righting wrongs. The journey wasn't over, but for Emily and her mother, it was a step toward reclaiming what had been stolen from them, their sense of safety, their peace, and most of all, their dignity. The courtroom's final verdict echoed in Emily's mother's mind as she sat in the quiet of their home. The weight of the trial had taken its toll on her, but the relief of knowing that justice had been served provided a faint glimmer of peace in the midst of so much turmoil. Yet, as she looked around their once happy home, she realized that while the legal battle had been won, the emotional scars of that day would never fade. The shattered sense of safety, the feeling of being watched, the trauma of seeing her daughter lying in a pool of her own blood, Those things would remain with Emily for the rest of their lives. Emily, though physically recovering, still carried the weight of that moment. The shooting had left deep emotional scars that would take time to heal. Her mother did everything she could to help her through the dark moments, but the trauma of the attack was something Emily would have to learn to live with. The nightmares, the fear of the outside world, the hesitation when she looked at the lawn where it all happened. It was all a part of the painful recovery process. But Emily was resilient, and as time went on, she slowly began to reclaim her joy. She would wheel herself outside again, but this time, it wasn't just about the flowers or the wind in her hair. It was a symbol of her strength, her defiance, and her determination not to let fear control her life. Her mother stood by her side, always, as she had since the moment Emily was born, helping her navigate this new world, one that was forever changed. As Emily ventured back into the yard, her mother often found herself standing just inside the door, watching her daughter's hesitant steps toward the lawn. Each time Emily returned, it felt like a victory not just over Karen, but over the fear that had tried to take root in their lives. The grass under her wheels no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a place of healing, a place where Emily was free once again. But the recovery wasn't just physical or emotional. There was a larger battle to fight, one that extended beyond the confines of their home. Emily's mother, emboldened by their victory in the courtroom, became an advocate for others who had suffered similar injustices. She knew that their story, could make a difference. It wasn't just about her daughter, it was about all the other children and families who might one day find themselves in the same position, struggling for their right to exist in peace. With this newfound purpose, Emily's mother began to speak out. She attended meetings, wrote articles, and used their story as a platform to shed light on the abuse of power in HOA communities. She wanted to make sure that Karen's actions didn't just go down as an isolated incident, but as a wake-up call to everyone who believed that these organizations were above reproach. She worked tirelessly to help pass legislation that would protect disabled children and their families from overbearing HOA rules that stifled their ability to live freely. It was a difficult and often discouraging process, but every small victory, every piece of progress, was a step toward ensuring that no other mother would have to endure what she had. Meanwhile, Karen, despite her conviction, still had supporters within the community who believed she had done the right thing. Some neighbors, those who had turned a blind eye to her actions, continued to defend her, claiming she had only been enforcing the rules. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Emily's mother refused to be deterred. She knew the truth, and she would never stop speaking it. The ongoing fight in the community was a stark reminder of how difficult it could be to stand up against injustice, even when the evidence was clear, even when the victim was a defenseless child. But Emily's mother had learned something valuable in the months following the trial. That silence was just as dangerous as the injustice itself. She refused to allow Karen's actions to be swept under the rug, and she made sure that everyone who had supported her, everyone who had allowed her to act with impunity, knew that they were complicit. But even as Emily's mother fought for justice on a larger scale, she also focused on healing her family. The bond between mother and daughter had always been strong, but the events of the past year had deepened their connection in ways that words couldn't express. Emily's laughter, though quieter now, was still a sound of resilience, of strength, and of love. She had learned to live in the shadow of that traumatic day, but she had also learned how to move forward. For Emily's mother, the greatest victory wasn't the courtroom win or the changes in the community. It was seeing her daughter slowly but surely come back to life. The lawn, once a place of terror, had become a symbol of hope. And every time Emily wheeled herself out into the yard, her mother was reminded that despite everything, they had made it through. They had survived, and they were stronger for it. The final act of this journey was not about the conclusion of a legal battle or the closure of a traumatic event. It was about moving forward, about taking back what was lost, and about reclaiming the peace that had been so violently taken from them. Emily's family had endured the worst, but they had come out on the other side, together. And that, in the end, was the greatest triumph of all. The battle wasn't just won in court, it was won in the quiet moments of healing, in the strength that came from the love they shared, and in the unwavering belief that no one, no matter their power or authority, had the right to take away their peace. If you believe in standing up against injustice and fighting for what's right, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Join us here at HOA Denied Access for more powerful stories of resilience, legal battles, and the fight for justice. Don't miss out on future content that will leave you inspired and ready to make a difference. Subscribe now and stay tuned for more.